Thank you all, and welcome back, Kerry and Anne. I thought we would start by talking about a recent book that I know all of us have developed a relationship with. Kerry was the first one to tell me about this project, in fact, several years ago. And it's a central part of one of the chapters of Anne's book. This is not, maybe as you might expect, part of the recent flood of popular publishing about Twain, although I hope we get to that at some point, but is rather a critical edition and the first publication of the Morgan manuscript of Pudd'nhead Wilson. This came out 2 years ago now?
Yeah,
about 2 years ago now. And it's called the Morgan manuscript because it was auctioned off and J.P. Morgan bought it, and it has been in the Morgan Library ever since. It is, based upon my assessment, the closest approximation we have to what Twain intended for that narrative. But it was never published in full until 2 years ago, in part because, and I won't get into the elaborate story behind the manuscript, but in part because Twain's bankruptcy disturbed his attention to the details of publishing Pudd'nhead Wilson. And so this, for me, is the most exciting event in Twain studies over the last few years, even though there's a lot to talk about in terms of Twain's impact on popular culture in recent years. I think this will have a lasting impact on Twain's studies, in part because Pudd'nhead Wilson is already certainly the most talked about Twain text amongst critics in recent years. Since 2020, the most talks and symposium papers and events here at Quarry Farm have been about Pudd'nhead Wilson, more even than Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I also think it is increasingly one of the most taught Twain works, although that is a little bit harder to measure. And so I thought I would start by asking the two of you to talk about, Kerry participated in the editing of the manuscript for the Mark Twain project, and as I said, Anne is one of the first critics to talk about it in a university press publication. And so I thought I would start with, what do you make of this introduction and the effects that it has, the way it changes that novel and maybe Twain studies more generally?
What?
Well, I think that is totally unfair of Kerry to me, but I guess I can go back. I was at the Morgan Library doing this research, and it was the first time I was ever at one of these archives where it's like white gloves, you walk in and you're feeling very special, and I have to put all of my material in a locker, and I was so impressed by myself, and I really felt important. And so I went and I said, I would like the Pudd'nhead Wilson manuscript, please. And they were like, yeah, here, whatever. And they gave it to me, and they were very offhand. And then I realized the person, like, 3 rows down was looking at, like, a Guggenheim Bible, right? And they had no interest. Gutenberg, yeah, Guggenheim. And they listened to me, I'm like, what do I know? So I really felt very silly, and then I started moving through these tiny, and Kerry can certainly talk about this more than I can, these sort of an array of small manuscript pages, typescript pages. You look at them, and Twain has crossed out huge crossouts and then written over and over, and you get a feeling of kind of madness, that he is beset by ideas that he wants to communicate and feels that he can't communicate simultaneously. There is a moment when he writes to his publisher and says, please get me out of business. So as he's trying to write this document, he's on the verge of his bankruptcy. And you can feel that as you move through the manuscript. He's taped things into it. I mean, if you were a person interested in visual art, you could even do a display on the various ways in which these pages tell the story of a writer desperate to find his novel. On the other hand, I think that when I read it from soup to nuts, from beginning to end, what I also felt was his return to Hannibal and his desire, at least for me, the thing that attracted me the most, his encounter with his own father. And in the male figures that you see that surface in Pudd'nhead Wilson, you feel his desire to kind of expose them, to take them down. So that figure of Tom Driscoll, who is a murderous...
no relation to me.
No. That we know of.
And I thought she was my friend.
Right, the jury is out on that. But Tom Driscoll is a kind of venal, unattractive character in the published version that we've got. When you read the Morgan manuscript, he is a black man with a grievance, is the way he's described. And, you know, in the book that I wrote, I thought I was so clever with this. I said that could actually be kind of, he's sort of straight out of Dawson's Landing. He wants to kill the white father. And you go through it, and the Tom Driscoll in the Morgan manuscript wants to find his father and kill him. And I think this is a slight overstatement on my part, but at least we're not recording this, and so I don't have to worry about it. But one of the things that you see in the Morgan manuscript is Twain representing scenes from his own past, where his father at one point leaves to sell Charlie. We don't know if Charlie is an enslaved man or if he's a horse.
God.
But Twain actually says it wouldn't have made a difference. And he sells Charlie off, and in the manuscript, Twain tells the story as if Judge Driscoll is selling off, and Judge Driscoll is the white father figure, selling off an enslaved man. And Twain writes, he did not know that the Negro was a human being with a heart to break and a family that would miss him. And then he crosses it out and doesn't publish it. So, I mean, that for me is this, it's Twain on the edge of being the Mark Twain that we like to imagine he always was, but also unable to finally confront his father in the way that maybe I wish he had. So it's a really powerful manuscript.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So in the 1890s, as Anne alluded, you know, Mark Twain's finances are circling the drain. And he is desperate to make money. And so, you know, he relinquishes some, I guess I'll call it authorial control, right? You know, so we have the Morgan manuscript, and then that becomes a serialized publication in the Century magazine. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, I don't want to get into the sort of ins and outs of the history, you know, but first there was
it's worth reading
you know,
to itself. It's
there's
very
this sort of farce
yeah.
called Those Extraordinary Twins, which is about Siamese twins, and then, you know, the characters of Roxy and Tom Driscoll creep in and kind of predominate, and then he realizes he has to perform what he called a literary cesarean, right, you know, so the point that I want to make is that the text that all of us have been reading now for decades, called Pudd'nhead Wilson, is not quite boulderized, but it is really compromised, and it's not what Mark Twain wanted. I mean, he simply like relinquished control to the Century. You know, whatever you want, you give me the paycheck, basically, right? You know, because things were that bad for him, and so the great service that the Mark Twain Project has provided is to now give us that full, rich history, to show us the inception of this book in the Morgan manuscript, bring us through the Century publication, you know, ultimately to the one that we're familiar with. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. I wanted to start with the Morgan manuscript in part because I think it epitomizes something about Twain Studies which both keeps us all deeply invested in it, but also can create a sense of frustration, as Anne just mentioned, and as becomes kind of a theme of your book as well, right? That there is an extraordinary archive of Twain's writings, certainly published, right? But also unpublished, and the massive majority of it resides at the Mark Twain Project at University of California, Berkeley, that Kerry, in her sort of second life of a scholar, has been working at. But as a Twain scholar, that's a wonderful thing. It's a thing that very few other author studies scholars can say, right? Is that there's this enormity of unpublished material or largely unknown material that is available to us even 115 years, past Twain's death. However, part of why I wanted to talk to Anne about this is she also points out that this can be deeply frustrating because of the way it forces us to, or maybe tempts us to, pick and choose which parts of the Twain canon we hold up and honor and recognize, and so much of it is in conflict with itself, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I thought we might talk a little bit about, I'll start with Anne, about how you are grappling with which parts of Twain's published work, need to be honored and recognized, and which parts of his unpublished work need to be either held up and exposed to light a little bit more, or we need to criticize him for the fact that he didn't publish them, right? That there's a choice that he often makes, right? that you really focus and hone in on.
Well, I would say open the doors, publish it all, right? I mean, I love all of it. And we were talking earlier, and I had said in a very flippant way that, I like my rock and roll performers to have a little drug and alcohol addiction. I like my comedians to have some childhood trauma. I like my artists to be just muddy and confusing. This is who these people are. This is what it means to produce art at times, great art and great history comes from flawed people. That's it. We're living in a moment, though, when in schools and even in academia, right, especially with Mark Twain, we will not allow what Kerry has called the gray areas to dominate. We want a black or white Mark Twain. And a lot of the unpublished works deepen our appreciation for his humanity, in part because he's struggling. In the book that I've coming out, one of the things that I take him to task for is the decision not to publish The United States of Lyncherdom. So, I won't go into too much detail, but there is a massive spike, as we all know, of physical assaults and lynchings of African Americans during the post-Reconstruction period, Reconstruction period, into the beginning of the 20th century, and Twain knows about them. We know that he knows about them because he's following a published list that was published in the Chicago newspapers about lynchings that happened this week, this year, this month. He's got them sort of pinned up to a wall. He writes this blistering indictment of America. And it ends by saying, at some point I'm going to live to see, and of course this would have been the polite word that he used, a Negro hung in Times Square with 10,000 people cheering. And he's all set to publish it. And in typical Twain fashion, he's like, this is going to make a mint because nobody's published this yet. And I'm like, oh, Twain. So close to saying the right thing. And yet, and then 2 days later, he writes and he says, I'm not doing it. And he said, I think the project has to happen, but I won't have a friend left down there. Yeah. And he means the South, if I publish this. But I wish I could think of the right man to do it. Well, now, if it's not Mark Twain in 1905, who is it? And I think that it's interesting to think about the way in which cowardice is almost always present in all of his literary texts. He's talking about people who evade, evasion's one of his favorite words. He says that the whole human race is filled with cowards, and he said, none leading the parade.
Carrying a banner.
Carrying a banner, right? Like, why not listen to him as he explores his own failures, right? Isn't that a great way to then also look at the moments when he rises above them? So the same year that he does not publish The United States of Lyncherdom, he publishes To the Person Sitting in Darkness, or close to it.
Yeah.
Carrie remembers the dates. I'm like, whatever. This is why I could never work at the Mark Twain Project. We've established this over and over again. But he's got this incredible courage that surfaces at times. But when it comes to confronting issues of race, at times he steps back. And we have scholars working today who are so worried that we might put a little mud on the white suit, right? That they will not just let the humanity of the man surface. It's fine. He can be flawed. So I think that for me is one of the central reasons that I wrote this book. That let's look at the things that weren't quite surfacing. Let's look at the battles that he lost, and let's see if we can arrive at some peace with him instead.
Just sort of riffing on what Anne said, one of the things that keeps me perennially interested in Mark Twain is the complexity and the contradictions in his personality. The facets do not easily cohere. There are just things that are irreconcilable. And what Anne was saying about, he made some incredibly bold statements throughout his career. Case in point, what he has to say about the Chinese immigrants in Roughing It in 1872. All right, the boot-licking scum, right, of the population are the ones who deride the Chinese. It's like, whoa, even reading that in 2025, it sort of, makes your neck snap back, right? And yet, that was a facet, a moment, an episode, right? And then there could be moments where he was so concerned about his legacy, his inheritance, what would become of his daughters, would he leave them in some sort of financial duress if he was too outspoken? And so, for me, that's what attracts me to Mark Twain, all right? That it's not a neat or easy picture. It doesn't all fall together nicely. It's thorny, it's prickly, it's contradictory. It's ultimately, to my mind, irreconcilable, in a way. But that, to me, is what makes him human and what makes him interesting.
I want to follow up just slightly there and maybe have Kerry share with us a little bit about how she sees the project. I know it's not you alone by any means, but how you see the project grappling with this question, right? That the Mark Twain Project has been publishing Twain works more or less continuously since the 1960s. And still, there's a lot left.
Not even halfway there.
Right. And so how does the project grapple with this, appetite for, we would like all of it to be out there, but you have to choose what comes next and in what moment. And obviously there are some, market, factors that go into that. And so can you walk us through a little bit of that?
I can, and I don't want to be tedious or boring about it, but the commitment is unwavering, all right, to publish everything that the man wrote, all right? And I don't know when that will happen, perhaps in the 22nd century, if in fact the funding holds out for that long. But digitization in this regard has been a boon for us. So for example, on the Mark Twain Project site, very recently was uploaded the river notebooks all right, very early on from the 1850s, where he is a cub pilot on the Mississippi River, and so there's this incredibly rich new resource, that opens up kind of Mark Twain before he became Mark Twain. So I think that will facilitate the completion of our goal. But I don't know how much more detail you want me to go into.
I just think this is a kind of core issue in Twain Studies, right?
Yeah.
It is that the enormous amount of material and the increasing accessibility and a lot of, like you said, the digitization projects of the letters and stuff are have been enormously useful to scholars, but there's still so much more, right? There's this horizon that presents a problem for those of us who are studying Twain, right? We're always wondering, is the thing that disproves my point, right? Still out there.
File drawers. Yeah. Exactly. So there are 3 published volumes called Mark Twain's Notebooks and Journals, and they only take us up to 1891. All right, so we've got not quite 30 years, and so this is in our latest grant application to the NEH. Does it still exist? Big question. All right, but I mean, we would like to publish all of Mark Twain's notebooks. And Mark Twain's notebooks are really fascinating. If you ever have a chance, just open up one of those 3 volumes, because they're weird. I mean, they're like staccato notes. I remember my first impression of them, I was like, I don't know what to make of this information. Like any writer, he always had a notebook in his breast pocket, and he would just randomly write things down, train schedules, observations of the person who was sitting next to him, jokes, things he overheard. I mean, but they are really this incredibly rich sort of writer's toolkit, And I think if you spend enough time with them, you can get very close, maybe not fully, but to getting inside his head, and seeing any writer is a sponge, right? But he's always observing, taking things in. Maybe he won't ever use it per se, it won't appear in a work of fiction, but nonetheless, he's engaging it. He wants to preserve it, and maybe it'll be useful sometime, But I think, the demands of the marketplace, academic publishing, university publishing, is very much under attack these days.
Very precarious.
So, the reality of whether we can fulfill, the Mark Twain Project can fulfill its mission, that is an open question and a very serious question.
Yeah.
Because I just don't know if the cultural landscape, will permit that to happen.
Yeah. Perfect. I want to jump off from the chaos of Twain's mind into Anne's book, which I think there is a way
It's also chaotic.
to tie some of Anne and Kerry's recent work together. One of the things you talked about last night was a kind of affliction that Twain has through his sort of sensitivity to spaces and process and routines, and that you have this wonderful description of how he's trying to work in this house where there is also domestic disturbance going on, and he can't help but become immersed in it, right? And I think
she lost an earring. Oh no!
Yeah. This is what he sees as the challenge of his writing process, but as you play out, it is also one of his great gifts, right? That his sensitivity to the dynamics of what's going on around him lead to these wonderful descriptions. And this is also a kind of theme of Anne's book and her kind of multiform conception of ghosts, right? Is the extent to which Twain is grappling with 3 or 4 different conflicting narratives at once sometimes, and is a kind of captive of time and place, that can both do great things for his art, but also keeps him in this kind of schizophrenic position. And so,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm not sure that, like, I think if there's a connection between what Kerry was working on last night, which I thought was fascinating.
I paid her to say that.
Yes, no, it was.
It cost me a lot.
We were, there's a 6-pack in the refrigerator. But is the notion of the amanuensis, that Twain is, and this ties back to scholars from decades and decades and decades ago who were interested in a kind of Freudian reading of Twain, and what's in the unconscious that's burbling up, and so you have people like James Cox, who I just loved. He was at University of Virginia when I was there, thinking about Twain wrestling with his unconscious. So my book talks a little less about like the space and place of his composition strategies than his sense of being, and I'm sorry to overuse this term, but haunted by narratives that he wants to tell, is afraid to tell, won't tell, and in time tells part of. One of the things that I think he is most sort of anxious about is the specter of an empowered black man, which is coming up on the horizon, and the relationship to white masculinity that might suggest. What are the relationship in the 20th century between white men and black men, and what happens when white culture is asked to pay the price of its crimes, and that may not be a story he can tell because the guy he's looking at in the mirror looks a lot like the guys that he's, that are responsible for some of those crimes. So how do you tell that story? And over again you see him wrestling with that. So I think that's where, when I was thinking about what Kerry said last night, that he imagined himself as kind of like channeling the narrative, that the stories come to him. Well, at times they seem to be, honestly, they seem to be torturing him. And I see that in Pudd'nhead Wilson. You see it at the end of his life in the Mysterious Stranger manuscripts also, which is just nutty. Like, just don't read it. I think that's my feeling. Like, it's a tough read, but you can feel him working his way towards some conclusion that I don't think he feels like he can quite draw. And so that's where I think the connection might be between our work. And Kerry's work on Native Americans, I mean, this is not a story that a lot of people want to hear about Twain. That he was at times just openly racist about Native peoples. When I read Kerry's book, one of the things that I kept writing to her was like, I can't believe I didn't know this. And not just about Twain, but about the suffering of Native peoples. And it was just stunning. There are a few things, I don't have nearly as much new material like that in the book that's coming out, but there are moments when I think, we ought to be talking about this, that in fact that Twain, went in blackface to a ball in Paris in 1892, dressed as Uncle Remus. Yeah, right, I just saw that. So I was like, ooh, that one hurt. I'm like, yeah, I know. But if I put that in front of a class, one of the things I can say is, okay, well, what's this dress up that he's doing? Does he think this is funny? Where does this come from? Is this part of a performance that's fluid? Is it, we can explore it. But if we can't even talk about it, we're in trouble. So I think there are going to be people that are troubled by the fact that I'm pointing out some of the the unhappy choices that Twain made. But I also admire the man for struggling to try to make better ones.
Yeah.
Did he struggle with his opinions on the Native Americans, or was he just blatantly...
He struggled mightily. And so one of the things that I argue in my book is that when you compare Mark Twain's attitudes towards Native people with his attitudes towards African Americans, the story about African Americans is an easier one to tell, although it's not.
Yeah.
It is fraught all right, as Anne's book argues, but there is what I call a redemptive arc, all right? So a boy born in a slave state to a family that actually owned slaves, and then meets Olivia Langdon, right? And is connected with a family with strong abolitionist ties, and then he becomes much more enlightened and progressive. So you can chart, all right? Okay, unfortunate beginnings and origins, but he unlearned that racism. He quote unquote, outgrew it, and becomes this champion, all right, of African Americans. The story with Native peoples is much more uneven, all right? So you have these moments which some critics have sort of highlighted selectively. So for example, in 1886, he encountered an editorial in the Hartford Courant, his local newspaper, about a bounty on Apache scalps. And he was so appalled at the inhumanity of this that he literally tore it out of the paper, used a pin to stick it to a letter to Grover Cleveland, then the president, saying, "Mr. President, you must stop this scoundrelism," right? And so that's 1886. 1889, he publishes A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, in which he routinely refers to the Knights of Camelot as a bunch of polished up Comanches, who aren't fully human. And so that's just the one example I'll give to you of sort of the unevenness. He'll have these flashes of sympathy, and then he slides right back in to, a very sort of regressive. And the other thing is, and I'll just try to say this very quickly, when I began to do the research, I kept looking for a smoking gun. I kept thinking, there's got to be a reason why he hated Indians so much, and I never found it. It doesn't exist. And that was a real crisis moment for me in the research of the book, because I was like, well, why then? But then I realized it was actually a moment of liberation, that there wasn't one pivot point, right? His great-grandmother, right, living on the frontier of Kentucky in around the time of Daniel Boone, right, around the time of the American Revolution, there had been an Indian attack on their cabin. And it was known in the Clemens family lore as the Montgomery Massacre, right? However, you all know about the Clemens family, that he had an older brother whose name was Orion, right? 10 years, his senior. And Jane Clemens, bless her soul, all right, used to love to tell stories to the kids at bedtime. And one of her favorite stories to share with these young, impressionable, easily terrified children was the story of the Montgomery Massacre, right? Now, Orion grows up to be this real champion of Native American rights. So, he's hearing the same story that Sam heard, but had a much different takeaway from it, right? So I couldn't even point to that as the smoking gun. So it's a very strange and complicated situation.
I think I think our desire to find the explanation, to find the smoking gun that explains the racism, to chart moral growth in a really sort of redemptive pattern, right? That's part of what I think has done the most damage to Twain Studies. And we continue to see it today. This, people who are obsessed with polishing the reputation of the individual. And we've seen this mostly around the character of Jim, right? Trying to prove to us that Jim, 100% was, he was not a minstrel character, and there was nothing in that character that we should be offended by. And it's like, don't believe your lying eyes, listen to me. And it would be much richer to think about how attuned Twain is to the racism of the culture, to his own deeply humanistic impulses, and also sensitive to his own desires as a comic to land a joke no matter who gets hurt. You know, he's not a minister. And we often try to teach, you know, I was at a school district, and one of the teachers said that she really thought that you could get some important life lessons out of Huck Finn. And I said, no, don't do that. I was not invited back, by the way. And I said, literature's not a life skills manual. Like, no one watches Hamlet to figure out how to get along with their mom. You know, like, it's not a great... Literature is supposed to just, it's like, put us into the muck of humanity. And Twain knew how to do that. But the more we try to explain away Twain's racism, it's a vicarious way of explaining away the countries. And so, you know, Twain is the representative American artist, and if Twain is not racist, we're not racist. End of story. And that I see playing out in all kinds of scholarly text. I see it in classrooms, and it's one of the reasons that no one's reading Mark Twain. I've made this point in the book, you know, and I think it might be wrong, but let's just pretend it's right. You know, I called around a few school districts to ask what their required reading was, and I got some help with some local teachers. It seemed to me that in most of the major school districts I was looking at, in California and New York City, Twain is no longer required reading.
Yeah.
I got hung up on a couple times, like Georgia and Alabama, and I just stopped calling, but why assign him? He's troubling. He's going to get a teacher in trouble one way or another, so just don't read him.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, in 2007, I do a lot of work as a consultant with the Mark Twain House in Hartford. And in 2007, Huck Finn was challenged just across the Connecticut River in a town called Manchester. And as the result of that, you know, and we rushed in and we conducted all kinds of workshops and tried to liaison with the upset parents, etc. But the end result of that challenge was that Huck Finn was removed from the required curriculum and went into only an elective curriculum. So, you know, students would, juniors, sophomores, whatever year it was, would no longer be required to engage that novel. They would self-select, you know, say an honors seminar where they would read it. And I do think Anne is correct that that's happening with more and more frequency around the country. And for me, it breaks my heart because it makes me think about what we lose when we take the writings of Mark Twain away from the youth of our country. You know, that I think is really, really troubling.
I agree with all of that, although I do think we have to acknowledge it in a broader context of the removal of books from, and particularly works of fiction from primary and secondary school curriculums at large, and particularly anything that is older than the 1950s and 1960s, right? That Twain certainly, his one-time hyper-canonization is a far away time and place, and he has definitely been falling out of favor in a variety of pedagogical contexts, both collegiate and secondary, but so has everybody else from the 19th century.
So I had a phone call from a former student of mine who's an assistant principal at a local school district, and they're removing The Bluest Eye. And your point about removing literature is hugely important, because, you know, I had a colleague of mine who's a biologist, and she said, I can see the effect of students only reading memoir and sort of fact-based writing, because they're no longer comfortable with mystery in the laboratory. They're uncomfortable with what, if it presents itself in a way that isn't easily categorized, if it's not a problem you can solve instantly, if it doesn't fit their idea, they can't wrestle with it. And the literary is exactly what
that ambiguity.
It teaches you ambiguity. Where I and I may be fighting old battles, but I think as scholars we're obliged to embrace the ambiguity and not to insist that Twain in particular be a stand-in for the American flag. And I really see that happening. I'm glad with works, and we don't have time to get into it, like, I really like James, although I wanted to just, like, I just wanted to trip Percival Everett down a flight of stairs because he published it, like, about 4 months before my work came out. And so I had to go back and include a little bit on James in, like, the 3rd chapter. But I think that novel has done some good work, you know, to help us to get Twain in dialogue with what's contemporary. But there are other things that have come out recently that aren't doing that. So
yeah, this is, you know, one of the questions that I definitely wanted to raise. I agree with you. In fact, I already have lots of anecdotal evidence of Twain getting back into curriculums through Percival Everett, right? That pairing of James and Huckleberry Finn is going to do a lot of good for getting Huckleberry Finn in front of college students and high school students in the coming years. And so we've just talked about the fact that students aren't getting exposed to, aren't reading Twain at the rates that they once did. But we have also had, just a few months ago, in the 175th anniversary issue of Harper's, the declaration of a Twain revival. Mm-hmm. James being one big part of that. The Ron Chernow biography. Chernow was here last week. Some of you may have been at the Mark Twain Tonight revival performance at the Clemens Center a couple of nights ago. These are just some indications of a kind of pop cultural revival of Twain. And this is not the first time, which is one of the few literary figures we can say about that. And Twain has had 3, 4, maybe 5 revivals. Yeah. And I think all of us come to that with a lot of suspicion, maybe even a degree of trauma, right? That just because you might think that a Twain revival would be good for business for scholars of Twain studies, but it contributes potentially to the polishing, to the ignoring of the grained areas, to the recapitulation of what I've called the Twain doctrine. And so I was hoping we could talk about what worries you most about or troubles you most about the popular depictions of Twain, and how do we maybe run counter to that if this is indeed a new era of Twain revivalism?
Well, I don't know. I mean, for me, the word, I struggle with the word revival. Maybe it's because I had, like, too much, like, Catholic school training or something, but, like, I don't trust revivalists, right? Like, I'm raised in a nice Catholic church, right? I'm 50 minutes and I'm out. I can't take a revival. And I think that I feel about the revival the way I would imagine some of the early native peoples felt when Columbus showed up and said it was a new world. And we're like, well, we've been here all along. I don't know where you guys have been. But so I think that it depends upon what the goal is of the person who is rediscovering Twain. Like, I will admit, and if Mr. Chernow is listening, I'm on page 999 right now, almost done with it. Not quite, right? I got a few more pages to go. And it's a decent book that's told some stories that a lot of people might have known. I think James is really provocative. I don't think James is that interested in Mark Twain. I think he's resurrecting, like, Ralph Ellison.
I think Percival Everett.
Oh, Percival. What did I say?
James.
Oh my God. I shouldn't have had that beer beforehand, but I think that he's in dialogue with all the untold African American stories that have been buried. What he's reviving is a voice that has never been expressed. So I would throw that out. You know, I'm nervous in this culture about rediscovering Mark Twain, because it feels to me like a very self-serving effort to burnish up other American values, and I'm suspicious. And you and I have spoken about this, that President Trump wants to put in a garden of heroes, and Twain will be in that garden. And as I've written somewhere, it's going to take a lot of fertilizer to make that garden grow, right? Like, that's a dangerous thing. And so Twain will be next to other great American heroes like Kobe Bryant, Lauren Bacall, Alex Trebek, who is Canadian, and there were several other examples of this. I think Elvis
Hope.
Presley, Bob Hope. I'm hoping they put Elvis Presley right next to John Winthrop, who was also not American. So is it a revival, or is this kind of, are we just digging up some old bones, right, that and propping them up against the wall? I'll reserve judgment. If someone publishes a great article about my book and says this is part of the Twain revival, I'll be like, oh yes, it is. Short of that, though, I don't believe it. So that's my feeling about the Twain.
You hear that, New Yorker?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Available anytime, Atlantic Magazine. So there it is.
Well, I can't hear the word revival without thinking about the scene with the King and the Duke in Huckleberry Finn. You know, come to the mourner's bench, right? You know, I just, my skepticism begins right there. You know, because it's a kind of frenzied, unthinking, you know, highly emotive. So.
That's where we are in the revival. We're not going to the revival. That's where we have to say.
When you said about the book about James,
Yeah.
when you said stories that, I think he said stories that hadn't been
told, yeah.
Is that because he's making up new stories, or is that because it's...
I've been thinking about ghosts so much, right? I've been thinking about ghosts, like that's and the metaphor of a ghost. And at the beginning of Huck Finn, Huck sits in the dark, listening to ghosts that make a noise, you know, that they want to be heard, but they can't make themselves understood.
Mm.
And I think that the country is, we're walking on grave sites all the time. That what we have here are, you know, what I think Percival Everett, what he recognized is that the same thing that Ralph Ellison recognized in Invisible Man is that there are stories of African American suffering and loss that we don't want to hear. And now especially we don't want to hear them. People are erasing that from all sites of history. I grew up in a Marine Corps family, and that records of the Harlem Hellfighters and the Tuskegee Airmen are being taken off of sites. This is horrific. I think that in that angry sound of the character James, and that in his erudition and his actual disregard for Huck Finn in some ways, what you hear Everett trying to say is, look, there are other narratives, there are other stories that need to be told that Twain didn't tell, and I'm going to tell them. And so I think that's part of what Everett's doing, and what I was trying to write about a year before he even published his novel. But yeah, you know, that's what I think he's doing in that book. I don't think he's not interested in redeeming Twain or reviving Twain.
No.
He's really interested in telling stories like, you know, Harriet Jacobs' suffering, you know, or what did it feel like to be Frederick Douglass on the, you know, those horrible plantations in Maryland. That's what he's doing. That's really the only one out of all these other works that are now engaging Twain that I think has any value. And so for me, he might be kind of a part of maybe he's reviving something, but and if he's listening, invite me over, because I would love to have a chat.
Well, I have an extraordinary personal anecdote to share. And that is that Percival Everett came to the Mark Twain papers last November, and he was given, sort of a deluxe private tour of the vault by our esteemed general editor, Bob Hurst. And Bob was showing him evidence from the manuscript and talking about Jim. And Percival stopped, and he said, "I'm really glad I didn't come here before I wrote the book, because I think I would have had to write a different book."
Wow.
Yeah. You know, because I mean, what he has said in innumerable interviews, is I read and reread Huck Finn 15 times until I got so sick of it, and he said some of it stuck and some of it didn't, but then once I closed the book for the final time, I never went back and looked at it again. And what, Bob, in his infinitely patient, and wonderful way, was showing him was textual evidence, about the characterization of Jim. And, quoting Mark Twain, it hit Percival Everett where he lives. Just like what Huck says about Tom, right? It hit, it landed. And it was an extraordinary thing to witness because, he reimagined Jim into James, but realized that perhaps something had eluded him, right, in Mark Twain's conception. So I felt incredibly privileged to be a fly on the wall, as I overheard that conversation.
And Kerry and I were talking before about all these unpublished, unwritten works, and one of them is Which Was It? And I talk about this character that Twain imagines, and it's toward the end of his life. I don't know, maybe it's 19, I'll make up a number, 4. I'm getting everybody's name wrong.
19.
40, it was
whatever.
1940.
Right,
yeah. But in Which Was It? He imagines a character named Jasper, who is an recently freed African-American man who manages to enslave his white former, quote, master, and has this master figure whose name is George Harrison, which I think is very funny. George Harrison is going to be his slave for the rest of his life. And Jasper says, now you know what it feels like, and I'm going to make you feel it every day. It's a vengeance tale, and it's James in some ways.
Yeah.
I mean, James is much more eloquent and has broader moral scope than this character, but Mark Twain knows Percival Everett's coming.
Yeah.
And he doesn't quite have it in him to write out that narrative.
Yeah. We have, first of all, thanks to Kerry and Anne.